our latest edition of the CES Friday Happy Hour. Glad to have you with us. Hope everybody is staying safe and healthy and beginning to gradually emerge and move around, of course, with the proper protocols in place. I have with us here today Frank Fannon. He is the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Energy Resources at the U.S. State Department. In his role there at ENR, he leads the department's efforts to develop and execute international energy policy in the interest of promoting energy security, economic growth, political stability around the world, and prosperity through developments in the energy domain. He has a tremendous background at BHP, Murphy Oil, as well as the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, where he was actually involved in drafting and negotiating various provisions for the Energy Policy Act of 2005. Frank, it's great to see you. Glad to have you here with us today.
Yeah, hey, Ken, thank you. It's great to be with you. I'd much rather be with you in person. I have to say that being a virtual diplomat, it's the same amount of work, but a lot less of the charm. But here we are.
I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to ask you how your life, your work life has actually changed. Because I know that from the standpoint of the work that you do at State, you are often on the road, and that face-to-face, being able to shake someone's hand is critically important. So
it really is. It really is. It's hard to really stress it enough about the personal relationship. And also, you know, I've been in meetings, I won't say where, but different parts around the world, and you have the official meeting, and there's all kinds of people on the other side sitting at the back bench, and you don't know who they really are, and the level of it becomes an exercise of talking point recitation rather than a real exchange. But then the walk from the meeting to, you know, put me in the car, that's where the real stuff can get done. And so we miss that. Now, this is 2 years now in this role, so we've got developed some strong relationships. So we're able to really continue to work at a high level. And I can tell you my staff, and I know Melissa Simpson, my deputy, was participating with some of your colleagues there. They will attest that the pandemic has not slowed our pace of work nor the quality of our deliverables. So we continue to work for the country. But I want to thank you for in the center for all the work that you guys do. When I was told at the time of this, I was thinking that sounds like a happy hour, but it is a happy hour, and I'm ill prepared for that. But I'm happy to be here for this discussion.
Yeah, we came up with that to try to give some positive outlook, I guess, in the wake of everything that's been going on, moving to this virtual sort of world that we live in today. So it's been a lot of fun, actually, and I've gotten a lot of really good feedback on these webinars, and I'm sure we will on this one as well. So great to have you here again. And real quickly, we have an energy and minerals program. This is for the broader audience. The energy and minerals program here, led by Michelle Foss, has been undertaking a number of initiatives trying to look at what it will take ultimately to develop resilient supply chains, where the potential risks might exist both politically and economically and commercially. And I know that you've been in the lead there at ENR, driving forth the Energy Resource Governance Initiative, ERGI, as you refer to it, and it really is focused on efforts to promote sound or best practices, if you will, in the mining sector, both in terms of governance and resilience, developing really good energy mineral supply chains, which is critical as we sort of think about the energy transition more generally. And I'm really glad that you're here to chat about a lot of this stuff with us. But I wonder, just at a high level, if you could give me and our audience a brief description of ERGI and some of the steps that you've been taking to promote the initiative that's being led there at the State Department.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I should back up a little bit and also recognize that the issue of critical minerals and the vulnerabilities the United States has with respect to our reliance on other parts of the world, not just parts of the world, on other other parts of the world that aren't exactly reliable sources of supply or perhaps secure. The president recognized that long ago, and it issued an executive order that called on the administration to do a full analysis of what are our vulnerabilities in the critical minerals space more broadly. And there's a report I encourage your viewers. I know Michelle is an expert on the findings. What we've done is looked at, as you indicated, issues with respect to the energy transition, and what is the volume? What are the first? How is that going to evolve? What time horizon and at what scale? And what we've concluded, and I had some views coming into this, worked in the resources industry, as you indicated, but what we see is there's a global bottoms-up demand for cleaner forms of energy. And it's a scale. Brookings had a number, something like 3.5 billion people in the middle class today. It'd be 5.3 billion in a decade. I mean, just the scale of this is tremendous, and all of this require the demand cleaner forms of energy. These energy sources are minerals intensive. You just don't clean and green, but it requires a really big shovel at the beginning of its life cycle. And so we started asking the question, well, where are these minerals? What are these minerals? Where are they? And are there new frontiers, given the scale of demand in the future, in the very near term? Where are they, and what are the opportunities and challenges? And we find that some of these minerals are tend to be in countries that don't have best practice. They don't have a level of standards that we certainly have adopted in the United States and other parts of the world have adopted. And we believe strongly that this transition, the demand for cleaner forms of energy, this is happening. It's this, as I noted, it's a bottoms up kind of phenomenon, and it's at a scale that's really quite remarkable. In fact, I would just say, even IEA noted that 2020, all forms of energy growth will drop, except for renewables.
Right.
It's going to continue, I think 6 or 8% will grow this year. So yeah.
So real quickly to that point, because I think you actually raise an interesting issue there. And this has certainly been reverberating across the energy landscape in terms of discussions. COVID-19, it's had a tremendous impact on economies around the world, on energy systems around the world, really testing resilience of supply chains, et cetera. I wonder if you could just briefly expand a little bit, and then we'll come back to best practices. Expand a little bit on your own outlook there at State and at ENR on what the impact of this crisis has been on renewable energy projects, supply chains, ramp ups of new energy technologies, and the energy transition in general.
Yeah, and in fact, the demand forecast that we're seeing, and it's both in terms of the kind of the quantitative analysis, I mentioned IEA's projections, but also qualitative work that we do, talking to companies and countries throughout the supply chain. All we're seeing maybe a blip in terms of delayed demand. It's not demand destruction. You see, and you know this well, Ken, whenever there's a significant drop in oil prices, the relative political ambition to do alternatives kind of dissipates. That I believe that cycle has been broken. A traditional cycle is gone now, and you see it by the amount of capital that U.S. auto manufacturers, for example, are investing, and they're committed to those investments. But what we have seen is some mines have to, because of the health concerns, they shuttered operations or limited operations, but a lot of them are back going. What it did underscore, though, is the supply chain of how supply chains operate, and there's the FT did some reporting on this, but some renewables projects maybe not come online at the same time horizon, but it's a matter of delay, not proper demand destruction.
Right. So going back to sort of building on just the continued transition and you mentioned earlier actually the demand for cleaner energy resources, that ultimately does trickle all the way back to the mine, right? Ultimately, we're talking about energy minerals and non-fuel minerals in particular. You mentioned best practices, right? So what is the approach that's being taken through the ERG initiative on how you collect and disseminate best practices and communicate those really to the counterparties that you're engaging with?
Yeah, thank you. So the ERG construct is really a government to government discussion, and we have four other founding partner countries: Canada, Australia, Peru, and Botswana. Diverse group of countries coming together who all have long histories of experience of responsible mineral development. But they're all different regulatory structures, different histories. And so what we came to do, we come together, and develop effectively why have we been successful and what are there lessons, best practices that can be used elsewhere and around the world. So what we've developed is this forum. We also have an online toolkit that is intended to be actionable. And you can go to ergi.tools to see it. It's open source, it's free. And this provides through all of the critical components for mine and development, talking about how to manage resources at the beginning stages, how to develop a geological survey, how to ensure that you have the best win-win kind of a situation for all stakeholders in terms of revenue. It provides a list of choices, and for each choice, it takes you down to a different path. And so there's nothing else like it. It exists in the world. And it's intended, again, for governments. And so this is another unique feature of this. We're pretty excited about it. We just rolled out the toolkit. The last travel I did was to PDAC in Toronto early March. And we unveiled the toolkit, and it's had considerable amount of, it's getting considerable amount of attention.
Excellent. That's great. I know there's a lot of interest here in that space, in the city of Houston and the state of Texas in general, which is, historically been dominated by oil and gas. But it also is home to a pretty sizable renewables footprint. The wind industry has a significant presence in the state. Something like 27% of the nation's capacity is in the state of Texas. So tremendous.
If you consider Texas to be a country, and some people do, I think, but it would be the fourth biggest wind producer in the world.
Right. That's right. Yeah, it is remarkable. There are some interesting juxtapositions, and I may use this to segue away from just a discussion about minerals for a second and get your thoughts on something, but and then we'll come back. But there are some interesting juxtapositions where you see pumper jacks in front of, or juxtaposed against, if you will, wind farms out in West Texas, and they exist side by side, which is kind of remarkable, actually, in many respects, and almost ironic in some ways. But I think it's a reflection of the diverse interests that exist in this state. I won't call it a country because it's not, but and on that point, because I think we do have a lot of interest from our viewers on this. The oil market, which is kind of a microcosm, if you will, of how devastating COVID has been, went through a very visible downturn to the point where on April 20th, WTI hit negative 37 and change. Volatility that was larger than anything we've ever seen before. And I know the US government and the State Department in particular got involved in energy diplomacy. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that, and then maybe use that to discuss what that might mean for future efforts across the energy landscape and where ENR is going to be focused.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, we kind of keep saying unprecedented, but the experience we've been through in the oil markets as well is part of that. What is some of the work we did? And Secretary, who you may not be aware of this, but he actually had a services company before he ever got into government. So he has a really keen appreciation for the industry and not just the big, the big major companies that we're all familiar with, but the the machinists, the people who work the fields over and provided the kit. So he gets it, and he certainly heard from, and we've heard from plenty of U.S. companies who expressed concerns. We've heard from elected representatives at all levels of government and in plenty of other countries. What we saw was, the COVID impact on demand was, but continues to be acute for the whole world, and it had a disproportionate impact with the kind of the OPEC plus disagreement on supply. So the secretary was engaged in that. He, in fact, spoke to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia mid-March. There's a public readout of this conversation, and really encouraged the kingdom to, as a global energy leader, to use its position of influence in that regard, but also its position of influence as the head of the G20, whose formation was to focus on economic stability of the world, right? And so here is a key point of uncertainty linked to the oil markets as having greater spillover effects on all economies. And so we encouraged the Crown Prince, the kingdom, to take that leadership opportunity. That we're pleased to see that they did so. And of course, because of that, there was the G20, the OPEC Plus got together. The G20 had their extraordinary energy-related ministerial. But the U.S., some of the work the U.S. has done, it goes back to our private sector and the responsiveness that our companies have in this country. According to IEA, the U.S. has had the greatest curtailment of anyone because of the market, and because of the market conditions. And that is a different way. And when we talk about energy diplomacy and we're talking to other countries, what they all expect, and they unreasonably, but they ask for the U.S. government to give kind of some dictate on what our percentage reduction of production would be. And we constantly are explaining that that's not the way it works. But we just, this was also going to, at the point when a lot of U.S. firms were announcing investment cutbacks, sizable ones, 30% chops in CapEx. So we just walk them through that. It's a constant bit of explaining. Domestically, the U.S. was taking action on the SPR to create that, basically a demand response as well, to kind of suck up some of that supply. And so the U.S. has been working hard on all levels. Where we go from here, I think that's important. When you mentioned when I worked in the Senate in 2005, and at that time, one of the things I helped Chairman Inhofe at the time do was draft and put forth the hydraulic fracturing provisions. So 2005, we did that. 2008, the shale revolution was born. Again, that's a reflection of the private sector, is innovation and just creating opportunity. What we see now is going from that degree of energy insecurity to energy abundance. Now where we are is really engaging partners around the world in the guise of energy partnership. And so that's the lens through which we look at this. And it's not simply about exporting our commodity, oil or gas, to other countries, but helping them. And back to your question, what is ENR's focus? Is where do they want to go in terms of their development path? What are the competencies the U.S. government, the whole of government, can bring to support them on that development path? And then are there other tools? And then are there U.S. firms that can be the implementers to that policy? So this is kind of the partnership approach that we have. But I have to say, the oil and gas revolution, our now energy abundance, it's created a considerable amount of foreign policy headroom for us to engage with partners all around the world. And that's pretty meaningful.
Absolutely. So a question that often comes up in the context of supply chain resilience with regard to minerals in particular is related to the concentration of minerals around the world. highly concentrated supply chains. And it's not just the mining activities, it's also the processing activities. And there are concerns as a result of that have been voiced in many circles about the potential for incredible disruption that could be geopolitical in nature. And I wonder, how ENR is approaching this issue, this question, and how ERGI is, in particular, that initiative is attempting to address it.
Yeah, thanks. So one of the things that ERGI is intending to focus on is to create, well, let me back up. Globally, there's one consistent statement by ministers or heads of state that I meet with, and they all want more U.S. investment, all of them. But when I was in the industry, they used to say it's not, the Earth's crust is blessed with resources all over the world, but what determines whether a best-in-class operator, miner, what determines whether they're going to invest there is what's above the ground. So what ERGI is intended to do is to help countries that want to attract best-in-class type of investment, to help them create the right set of conditions so that it makes that attractive for US firms or Australian or Canadian or whomever firms to invest in their country. That's what they want. But sometimes it's really hard. You just don't flip the switch and all of a sudden you do that. Some of these countries, there's a real capacity limitation. And so ERGI is intended to provide the tools. The ENR and the department and other elements will look to help provide financing so that they can implement that toolkit. And then we've integrated ERGI's principles into the relatively newly formed Development Finance Corporation, which is a new arm to provide, to help catalyze US private sector investment. And for the first time ever, the US government can actually take equity stakes in projects around the world. So it's a complete suite to help a country develop its resource base, manage it, and attract the best kind of investors. And if we believe, and again, it's not the US and the ERGI construct, we have 5 countries. We collectively believe that if countries adopt transparent systems, open, efficient market design, then it allows for the resiliency of global supply chains, and they're much more reliable and secure. And it takes away the concentration element that you spoke about.
So that's an interesting point you make, because I know something that our involvement actually with the G20 through the T20 task forces has really been focused on transparency and openness and creating market depth in many ways, because depth allows for resilience in supply chains because markets can respond more easily to one-off disruptions. And what you're describing sounds like ERGI is really trying to facilitate that same exact kind of outcome.
Another thing I think is important, if I can, Ken,
yeah,
is, and I know you're especially the oil and gas viewers can keenly appreciate, and the folks who are working in companies, the ESG related activism that a lot of companies have been facing, not just in that industry, but banks, et cetera. The focus has been pretty much singularly on the E part of that, and really in the context of climate change. We believe that there will be an eventual move, we already have seen signs of this, from the focus on climate change exclusively in the context of greenhouse gas emissions. There will be a wider perspective on the S and the G. And what that means is it will create a level of awareness and concern about some of these other related issues with respect to human rights. Child labor, unfortunately, is a celebrated case in this regard. The real undermining of institutions of countries. Are you empowering communities, or are you flying in workers from other countries. These are lasting kind of projects, 40, 50-year lifespans for a mine. So how you structure this is really important. Is it feeding corruption, or is it seeking to get out of corruption? Are we creating potentially, I really dislike this term, but others have used the term resource curse. Is there a new one based on what would otherwise be clean energy? We need to get ahead of this, or else there'll be two perverse outcomes. One, the world will not get the minerals it needs to achieve the energy transition that publics around the world are calling for. Or two, they will get those minerals, but it will be done through unscrupulous actors, predatory investment, and creating a new form of corruption, corrupt states and failed states. We want to avoid that. And I think by engaging, by ensuring that, ERGI's focus on I mentioned at the earlier state, really at the beginning, the foundation of mine and development, we want to start broadening the aperture to also include the entirety of the supply chain, because they all matter and they all have a point. As you mentioned, the processing element. Yeah. All of this has a point, and we need to be cognizant of these issues, because soon, very soon, the activists who are well-intentioned are going to apply appropriate pressure, and they're going to demand it, and companies must be responsive to that. So we want to provide countries with the tools and the ways to implement them, so that they're not caught in this situation, and that the world will be able to get the clean energy technologies it needs.
So it's interesting you mentioned it, and I'll use the term even though you don't like it, the resource curse, because this is obviously an area that is of considerable concern when you have an opportunity for resource development in some of the areas where minerals exist, where there's a dearth of development. I wonder, you mentioned a little bit about, creating sort of institutions, if you will, or helping to promote the creation of institutions within some of these countries that will help avoid that. But, there is there's a lot of competition in the energy mineral resource development space. And I wonder if you could elaborate just briefly on how ENR and state more generally is approaching that dimension of this discussion.
Yeah, we have a variety of engagements, bilateral engagements that we have. We have focused on the issue of minerals. We have one with Canada. We have another one with Australia. I have a broader energy strategic partnership with the Japanese. Again, the supply chain, if you think about those three countries alone. We've got a program at the department helping Greenland develop its own capacity. Greenland, it's about the size of Texas geography, with a population of 56,000 people. And they have a remarkable resource endowment, underexplored. But again, there's a capacity issue, and these are really hardworking, well-intentioned people. So we're helping them to set up and help do a lot of things there. So we have a variety of things that the department is doing to support in partnership with countries. But we also have the multilateral approach in the ERGI construct. They're all a little bit different. And we also have countries that are doing both. We have some programs, Peru's a founding member of a founding partner. We also have some bilateral programmatic work we're doing in Peru. So there's countries now, because they see the demand for these resources and where they're seeing in the exponential growth, they want to develop these industries, and they want to make sure they do them safely and with all environmental conditions that their people expect them to do. Countries that currently aren't passing that, aren't at that high level, they want to be at that high level. No one wants to be perceived, have a newspaper article with just horrendous pictures of children in them. So we're trying to help them turn the corner, and in so doing, we hope that they will demand whoever invests in their country to adopt a certain set of standards based on kind of the values that we all call for every day.
So I want to ask you, definitely related to that very issue, but about interactions with some of our most important historical allies in Europe in particular. I know you recently did a webinar with the International Renewable Energy Agency, and there's a lot of interest in Europe with discussions, for example, of the European Green Deal and using the COVID crisis to, in terms of the recovery effort, to really facilitate investments in clean energy. Because of that, you can envision that's going to create some demand pull in the space that we're discussing today. And I wonder if you could elaborate on where you see the state of play for those discussions and how the U.S. government is interacting with those governments in the ERG context.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so we've been talking to individual governments as well as the Commission more broadly. I've spoken to the Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson, as well as Joel Jorgensen, the Director General, and raised this issue, because you're absolutely right. Europe and the Green Deal, and now they're kind of moving the Green Deal forward with their COVID-related fiscal response. This is going to create an artificial demand catalyst for a lot of these to move them quicker. But Europe, historically has been one of the leading players in the broader transparency and calls for transparency and good governance. So there is a natural level of support for what we're trying to do. We very much welcome those discussions. They are concerned about it too. The last thing any of their corporates want is to, there to be a story that they're as they move forward with Green Deal implementation, that they're creating human rights or contributing to human rights challenges in other parts of the world. So they're extremely sensitive to these issues. Certainly some of the countries are as well. What we're trying to do, though, is provide that resilient alternative supply chain that's free of this. And ERG is one mechanism to help do that. There are a variety of other fora that are talking about these issues. But earlier this week, I participated in a webinar with IRENA. And in that context, the International Renewable Energy Agency. And they are very cognizant of these issues. And to have voices like IRENA recognize that this is a challenge is really important. They did a report, I think it was December last year. And it was about the geopolitics of the energy transformation. So there is an awareness of the issues that we're talking about here. And so the OECD has been talking about this. The World Bank recently issued a new report, updating an earlier report on posing the question, which is, what if the world were to achieve the 2-degree scenario? What does that mean for renewable and battery storage deployment, and then the implications for minerals? So there is a growing awareness about this. Again, I think the response, you have the government response, but soon, very soon, there will be a market response. And that will catalyze a level of focus on calling for these responsible and guaranteed responsible mineral supply chains. ERG is a mechanism to support governments in doing just that.
It's interesting that you say that, because in many ways, if you just put your historical lens on the energy discussion, we saw in oil markets, for example, tremendous transition in terms of shifts of power in the geopolitical context as we moved from the 60s into the 70s and the 80s and so forth. And I think there are a lot of lessons that can be learned and carried forward there. And one of them really does involve the creation of strategic stocks and the International Energy Agency and cooperative agreements among large consuming countries. And I wonder in that context, how much of a leading indicator does that play, do you think, in terms of what will happen in the mineral space? And is there actually, beyond ERGI, any real active conversation about creating an IEA style sort of cooperative engagement for energy security in the minerals space?
Yeah, that's a great idea. It's a fascinating one. You know, reflecting back, IEA's formation was right at the end of the oil crisis, and it was formed by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger because we need to create a degree of responsivity to this. That seemed at the time like a monumental task. What I'm about to say now, it's compared to a mineral supply chain for clean energy technologies, it's simple. You get a commodity, you dig it out of the ground, and then you find a storage place and put it back under the ground in some kind of a cavern and store it, and then wait for an event to occur, and then you pull it back out. Yes, you have to refine it, but that's pretty easy relative to trying to put together battery, scaled battery technology, given all of the steps. But that being said, we have ongoing the same kind of an approach. And I mentioned Japan, I mentioned Australia. I think that the private sector and government financing of some projects is also important. And you've got, there's a company, a rare earth company, an Australian company, when the Chinese withheld, they helped crater the rare earth price some time ago. The Japanese stepped in, took a big stake in an Australian rare earths company, which is now looking to build a processing facility in Texas. So you see this recognition of, that there is a market vulnerability. And so I would say that the IEA is a uniquely by government response. I think in the context, due to the complexity of supply chains for some of these minerals, my observation would be, it would be a government supported private sector kind of collaboration, a collaborative effort, and using that one instance as an example of that. We have ongoing some of the bilateral discussions with the Canadians, with the Australians, are speaking to these issues, but beyond a broader IEA-like framework, we haven't quite gotten there yet. Who knows though? I think it's a worthwhile idea. It just goes to how do we send the appropriate market signals? Because that's the other challenge. Is the market going to value the shared values that the United States and Europe, for example, are built on, or are they not? And the market signal is incredibly powerful. And what I think needs to happen is we need the alternative supply chains and the recognition of what is responsible to come to the fore.
Sure. So that actually begs an interesting question. And I'll ask you to put on your, in some ways, pontification hat, but take a view forward, right? In terms of the pace of energy transitions and the rate at which demand is growing for a lot of these critical minerals for renewable energy and clean energy technologies, if you were to look forward, say, 10 years, or even 20 years, where would you anticipate, and this is core to the efforts that you're engaged in at ENR, but where would you anticipate the discussion about security of supply chains is at that point? And do you see any potential road bumps along the way, if you will?
Yeah, I think in order to create secure supply chains, there has to be a recognition where clean technologies come from. It's really challenging to figure that out for someone who is not steeped in this stuff. You know, in whereas you can, the calls right now on corporates when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions isn't whether to report, but what is the standardized reporting going to look like? And when it comes to mineral supply chains, we don't have that yet. And I think until we do, it's going to be a bit fragmented. I think that's part of what I was calling for when the activist community and the finance community recognize and start to look beyond the E and also consider the S and the G, and how that will be internalized. What does that mean? That means that the US, for example, has considerable resources that could be developed, but there is in most instances, it's a controversial thing to start a mine or to develop a mine, an existing one, or expand one. But you can't achieve these questions of transition and going to cleaner forms of energy without it. So how is that future going to look like? And I think it's going to require some reflection, and for the greater degree of awareness, and for the market signals to be sent for that to really occur. But more broadly, looking 10, 20 years ahead, I was chuckling about your example with a wind turbine next to a pump jack. What I see is really the creation of holistic energy systems, where it's not a fossil base versus a renewable base, but an integration of systems, particularly in parts of the world that are really the growth centers. And I'm thinking of a program we have in India. It was a program focused on clean energy exclusively. And, in Prime Minister Modi has a very ambitious targets for renewables. They're doing pretty well on capacity, but there's some challenges on utilization. And so we went in and did a review, and we have a program there. And we've changed it to talk about flexible resources. So, this is a pilot project including 4 different federal agencies, 4 different states, public-private partnerships. I have FERC, the FERC chairman flew out to Delhi when we had this discussion. I mention it because what we're now looking at is, in order to achieve renewables globally at scale, gas has been foundational to that. You have gas, and then you incrementally increase renewables over time. Now, perhaps that traditional path will be changed once battery storage comes on scale and cheap. And so we're looking at this integration of energy systems. Digitalization of energy is another way. How do you optimize grid systems so that you can use the intermittency and it works without having trips? But that creates another vulnerability in terms of the potential for hybrid threats to cyber security of infrastructure. So for each positive step, we always have to recognize that there's a back door, if you will, where things can also go offside.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, you're highlighting that, which is really actually core to the work we're doing here in the Energy Minerals program. Is it's important to understand what the potential risks are, so that they can be anticipated and addressed, to keep things as smooth as possible. And I think another really important point that you've raised is, I think what ERGI is really trying to do is create a system where, in many ways, you eliminate as much risk as possible to promote capital inflow. And that will help, of course, promote economic development in various places around the world, but also help ensure the resilience of supply chains so that the energy transition can continue relatively unabated. So I think all of those things are really critical. And one thing that I'll also take away from this, because I think you hit on it a little bit with various things you said, is it's important to keep to remember history, right? Because we can learn lessons from other markets as they developed, and use those lessons to think about engaging with other countries through lines of diplomacy, through things like ERGI. I think it's fantastic. So I'm cognizant of your time. I know that you're a busy guy. Even with the largely work from home orders, I imagine that you're jumping from webinar to webinar and virtual meeting to virtual meeting. So I want to thank you for joining us today, Frank. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ken. And you know, ERGI is approaching its 1-year anniversary, or it'll be 1 year old from the time we initiated it. So I just want to invite your viewers to go check it out. ergi.tools. It's intended to be action-oriented, implementable. It's not. We're really pleased with it, but it's the beginning. We're kind of just at the end of the beginning. We're looking for greater expansion. It's going to be iterative. It's going to be expanded, and we're going to continue to integrate the best practices of the founding members to build out more modules. We're going to increase the amount of capacity assistance to help countries to implement the principles. And we're going to continue to use US development finance tools to help catalyze private sector investment to realize this responsible global mineral supply chain.
Fantastic. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
Stay safe, stay healthy, everybody. Same to all of you.
Have a great one. Have a good weekend. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.